some ideas on how to paint metal in Photoshop. Hello? I can help you with that. What kind of metal are you doing? Is there a specific character you're working on? Just your own thing. Okay, so you want like some weathered, just military metal. Okay, so the biggest thing with metal is, let's see, I'm gonna pull up my reference picture I have here. I'm gonna turn this down just a little bit so I can actually concentrate on what I'm saying. Okay, so the biggest thing with metal is, for one, figuring out a light source, right? So as you can see here on my Valk painting, I have little bits of like orange and brown kind of coming through, and that's because I'm thinking about the lighting that's going to be around them. Yeah, it's time for class. It's time for class. So you want to think about the light that's coming around the metal, right? So I'm going to be doing a very sunny, like strong contrast lighting for Valk. So you can see I have little like whispers of what the shadows are going to be, but the biggest thing is having your coloring and your lighting bouncing off the world around and reflecting into the armor. So because Valk's armor isn't as like shiny and chromy, it's a lot more weathered and dull. So you don't have to worry about that as much, but there will still be bouncing lighting and coloring like that. So the first thing you want to keep in mind is what kind of lighting. If you're just doing a default lighting, then you just mostly have to worry about shadows and definition. So the biggest thing to building up a metal like Valk's is layering. Unfortunately, you missed me doing it before, but when I do start a painting like this, so Valk's armor, for example, I'll actually grab a reference picture so I have like an exact reference to what I'm talking about here. So let me grab this. I can send this to myself. I just like to have it like next to me so I can show you what I'm working with, but we're gonna send this to myself on this. And then we're gonna go pull them up. Okay, almost there. Bam. Okay, so I'm gonna pull this up for you. Okay, so this is what we have. This is the reference photo that I'm working with for Valk. So, as you can see here, I mean, you have she's got no real background going on, but I find when you're doing armor that has detailing and things like that, that you should never really paint by section. So when I started Valk, instead of painting like section by section, you don't do that because it gets messy, it's hard to manage, and you kind of want to think of it as like the three-dimensional shape, right? So how is the light going to hit that first? So you're going to start by doing your shadows, your midtones. I do my highlights at the end, and I do my weathering at the end. I mostly want to worry about my shadows and my midtones, because your highlights, I find, for metal is what's really going to bring out the texture in it, right? So you really want to focus on your shadows and your midtones. You want those nice and solid so you can blend them out. You can see I actually started this process here. So I have my shadows and my midtones, and then I have a little bit of that hint of what kind of lighting is going to be around her. So because I'm doing a warm lighting, she has a little bit of like that muddy green coming in on the off shadows, because I like to have two light sources typically. So this one's going to be the sun coming from this way, so like this way. And then there's going to be like, I think it's called subsurface scattering with 3D modeling, where there's like light all around that bounces and touches different parts of the armor. So if you're doing some cool lighting, and if you were doing this green, for example, you'd be getting like a lighter green or a teal almost, like these kinds of colors here. But you don't want it too punchy, because with this material of metal, it's the color of the metal that counts the most. So I would start by making a nice blended section of your metals. And then on top of once you have this blended midsections, you have your blended shadows, you have your subsurface scattering of the hints of the lighting that's coming through. That's when you start to do decaling like this, like these little bits here or these little bits here. Because if you just look at this, if we were to just grab this piece for Valk, and we're just gonna blur it and blend it just so you can see. We're just gonna blur a little bit. This is the base of the armor, right? That's it. It's just a nice gradient. So I find breaking the armor down as layers is the easiest way to paint it. So you see in this metal piece, we've got our shadow here. We've got some subsurface scattering here. So we have like some rim lighting to the shadow. We have our main light source here, and then we just have all the midtones in between. So once you have that, and it's just a nice blended color, that's when you can start adding like decaling back in. So you can add the details back into the piece, and then you add the contrast. And once you have that done, then you can start adding your highlights and your texturing. And the biggest thing for armor pieces like this is weathering. So when you're weathering something, you want to look for the corners and indents and pieces like that. So here you can see, unfortunately, I have potato quality reference photo for you, so I'm so sorry. But you see you have little bits of weathering here. I'm going to just make this smaller. Here you have little rim lights for corners, which is really important. And you have little scuffs and pieces all around. And that's what's really going to build up the texture of the armor. But you don't need to worry about the texturing until you have your midtones and your shadows put, because it's if you're trying to do it all in one go and render it as you go, it's so overwhelming and you're gonna have a harder time building up the texture and the shadows. After you do your weathering, I typically don't do my weathering in like a super bright highlight color. I just do it a little lighter than the main color of what the armor would be. That's when afterwards I can go in with some highlights and I can start really just defining these lines, right? But you don't want too much. You want just enough where there's little snippets of it where your eyes can kind of fill in the rest. You know what I mean? So I'm not going to do a whole white highlight like this, because if you're trying to think about how the light is glistening on the armor, it's only going to pick up bits and pieces of the corners. So I like to take just little bits and slowly build them up, because you don't have to worry about it being absolutely perfect, because if it's a bigger piece like this, when you zoom out, it's just gonna, it's easy to see, it's so tiny, but it's just enough where it brings out the ridges and stuff. After that, if you want, once you have all of your colors blended and you start to do those indentations, you can add like layer effects on top with like texture brushes and start adding your lighting. But the biggest thing for working with armor is what kind of material it's made out of, because this is a very washed metal. But if you had a more chromatic one, then you're really going to have punchy lighting. You're going to have a bunch of highlights and shadows coming through, and it's almost reflective of the world around it. Whereas this, you're focusing more on the color. It's just hard because I don't know like what you're drawing specifically, so I can't help you in reference to what you're doing. But that's how I did Valk, is I built up all the different slow blending and building up of the values and layers, and then slowly adding detailing and weathering, and then at the very end is when I add those punchy highlights and those glossy bits. Because if you do it all at once, you're gonna have an awful time. Personally, for me, some people can just render it out and it's like, okay, damn, dude. But for me, it's easier to take it piece by piece. Otherwise, I get overwhelmed and it's not what I want. But you got to be patient. So that's I don't even know if that helped, but that's how I do it. It's all about the colors. The other thing is, when you're doing metals, try not to use black as a shadow. I find if you're using black as a shadow, it looks rather muddy. So for here, you can see I only do dark greens, and then if I want it a little darker, maybe I'll add in the browns. But I never really like doing black or absolute black unless it's like leather or things like that, where you have like those crazy contrasts, or maybe like a really vibrant metal. but I would stay away from, I mean, unless it's black armor, but even then, you can still add cool grays or warm grays. So if I wanted to make this like darker, I could grab this green, and instead of just going all the way down, I can maybe make it a little warmer because it's going to be a warmer atmosphere. You know what I mean? So try to stay away from blacks. I find that that just makes armor look so muddy and grungy, unless that's a style you're going for. I mean, you have like Darkest Dungeon, or I think that's what it's called, where they have like the really harsh shadows. And then, I mean, it's completely different when you're doing comic book style rendering where you have those really nice stark contrasts. But for painting, I like to stay away from black. I find that it muddies a lot of the shadows unless you're actually painting black. And even then, you can see here, I have like very little absolute black, and it's not even as black as it can go. So yeah. If you need help with any painting and stuff, or like a specific drawing, I do have a Discord you can post your character and I can help you, but I hope that did anything for you. I try to explain things and then I ramble, so that's how I approached Valka, though. That's how I've been building up her armor.